First of all, I was not the Triggerman. In the summer of 1963, from his bedroom window on the second floor of the Westchester Plaza Apartments, on the Belford Avenue side of the alley, Charlie Bellier shot little Dougie with an air-powered BB gun. I encouraged him to do it, but I was only the spotter, not the Triggerman. Dougie started screaming that he was shot. Charlie and I tore out of his bedroom, right through the living room, out the door, and down the stairs, out to the swing set area. And as the door slammed behind us, I heard Mrs. Bellier call out, "Slow down." The other kids stood around Dougie and stared. We were breathless and frantic as we ran to him, saying, "Dougie, Dougie, it's okay, it's okay." A couple of them smirked at us. To suspect Charlie or me was ridiculous. I mean, we were the big kids who looked after Dougie around the playground, right? Didn't we come to his rescue when bullies tore his new shirt and tried to beat him out of his Snickers? Dougie slowly calmed down until he was just sniffling, and most of the other kids went back to the swings and the jungle gyms. But Fred Spada hung around until Charlie said, "What are you looking at?" "Did you shoot him?" Fred said. Fred was Clayton Spada's little brother, 2 years younger than us. "What do you think, Spada?" Charlie said. Charlie liked to sound dangerous. "No," I said. "Fred, nobody shot anyone. That's crazy. We heard Dougie scream. We thought one of you guys did something to him." "Yeah," Fred said. "You guys are the ones who did something." "Get out of here, Spada Spaz, or we'll tell your mom that you did it," Charlie said. That seemed to work. However small Fred's respect or fear for us, Mrs. Spada inspired absolute fear and respect. Fred and Clayton attended Catholic school, went to Mass, and had to account for their whereabouts every minute of the day. Mrs. Spada was only 5 feet tall, but scary, even for us. She was from Ecuador and wore long, dark dresses and stood like a fire hydrant with a single black eyebrow folded over her dark eyes glaring, and she constantly looked out her front door to see if anything was out of order. She often yelled at us, "Do something constructive!" Her husband worked at one of the aircraft companies, and he came home in the late afternoons and nodded at us, but never said anything. Mrs. Spada greeted him at the door with a big smile, and that's the only time we ever saw that expression on her face. Then he'd disappear into the apartment, she'd give us that black look of hers, and then she'd follow him in. Fred went back to the jungle gym but kept watching us. Dougie pulled up his pants leg. On his calf was a slightly depressed hole in the unbroken skin, bright red, exactly the size of a BB. Charlie glanced at me for a minute, then shooed Dougie off to play, and Fred drifted after Dougie. "Jesus, Charlie," I said to him, somewhat relieved. "You could have really hurt him." "Hey, it was your idea," Charlie said. "Well, I just wondered if you could hit someone that far away. You shouldn't have to go and try and do it." "You wanted me to let you do it," he said. Well, I wasn't going to shoot some kid. We looked at each other for a moment. Charlie said, "We better stash that gun. If my mom sees it, she'll kill me." We went back up to the apartment and tried to slip quietly back into Charlie's room to hide the BB gun, but Mrs. Bellier walked out of the kitchen with her arm around a Tupperware bowl stirring banana slices into lime jello. That was a real delicacy. "Where were you two headed in such a hurry?" she asked. "What was going on down there?" "Oh, nothing, Mom. Kids yelling, you know." Mrs. Bellier looked at me and smiled. "Anything else?" I had a moment of paralysis. Well, Mrs. Bellier, we were, just, Dougie down there, and he thought that Charlie, come on! Charlie shoved me toward his room. To his mom, he said, "We got to put those wings on before the glue sets." Charlie built model airplanes. He pushed me into the room and shut the door. "What's the matter with you? You sounded like a dope out there." Charlie's mom was a whole other story. Divorced from Charlie's dad, Mrs. Bellier was, to me, and to every other friend of Charlie's, a knockout, a bombshell, the ideal. She was 5'3" or so, black hair cut short and a pixie cut, and she had these amazing curves that none of the other moms had. She didn't dress like anyone else's mom either. She usually wore tight, pastel-colored capri pants with either snug, sleeveless turtlenecks or light cotton blouses with the tails tied in a knot so that her breasts were just out there. Man. In those days, some women had a way of supporting their breasts that made them look like a pair of torpedoes coming at you or the front end of a '57 Cadillac. It was as if you were on the deck of a freighter in a war movie. the moment the German U-boat commander had screamed, "Los!" to launch a double salvo at the ship. I had no idea how old she was at the time, maybe 30, 31, 32. Although we were enthralled by the blonde icons of the era, Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, Mamie Van Doren, Mrs. Bellier was real flesh and blood. And for all of us who were beginning to really like girls, for reasons we didn't understand, Mrs. Bellier seemed to have a secret that we had to decode. We were fascinated with the way she talked, the way she moved. Every step she took in those capri pants made her butt flex to one side, and then this incredible, exquisite tension would build until suddenly, as her forward foot hit the floor and her back knee bent to transfer the weight, the whole round, packed, powerful mass of her perfect ass would just jump from one side to the other, followed by tiny quivering aftershocks. Then her calf would tighten, and the tightening would travel back up her thigh, loading her buttocks for the next salvo. And whenever I saw her walking, I heard jungle drums start up, and animals began roaring in my head. There were grace notes in the jiggle of her breasts against the broad chords of her hips swaying step by step by step. And when she talked to us, she would bend slightly forward at the waist so that our 12-year-old eyeballs jumped nervously from her enormous brown eyes to her warhead breasts. So close that I could feel her breath on my ear, she would lay her silky hand on my wrist and say, "Would you boys like some Eskimo pies?" After that, there was nothing we could deny her. Not that her influence civilized any of us much. I mean, beyond the range of her smile, or for that matter, Mrs. Spada's thunderous and condemning gaze, we reverted to our savage little selves. We ran wild, created adventures, organized ball games, and stayed away from our homes as much as possible. Summertime was the most wonderful of all. No school to rein us in, no fixed times to do anything. It was Lord of the Flies, but in a good way. We haunted construction sites and staged brutal rock fights in the excavations for future apartments. We raced bikes in the streets and tried to kick each other off. When a plastics factory burned down, we picked through the rubble while it was still hot under our red ball jets and gave off smoking fumes that I'm sure now were toxic as hell. We built rafts out of old pallets and floated them down a creek that I now realize was an effluent channel from the Frito-Lay factory. We played endless hours of over the line on the fields of the local school, scaling the 10-foot chain link fence with our bats and gloves, a fence designed specifically to keep us out. We scrambled over the tops of the 2-story apartment buildings that most of us lived in to evade Bob, the maintenance man, when he caught us doing any of the things that to him were off limits. We sprinted across rooftops with absolutely no consideration of gravity, but only concerned by what would happen if he told our parents. We returned to our homes for sit-down dinners, and at night slept in our beds like little angels, only to refuel the wildness. Gathered in the alleys and ditches and vacant lots, we smoked stolen Terrytons and discussed what we thought sex was, and who the prettiest girls at school were, and if Charlie Bellier was absent, what was going on underneath Mrs. Bellier's capri pants. Now and then one of the gang would sneak a Playboy magazine, and we would devour it like hyenas. Once I boldly checked out a book on sex from the public library, and we pored over it, trying to digest the technical discussions of vulva, inner and outer labia, clitoris, cervix, ovaries, vagina. It seemed complicated. Even our own organs took on a dimension that made them seem more like plumbing than something useful with girls. Glans, vas deferens, ureter, prostate, urethra, seminal vesicle. What was all this stuff? And how did it relate to the terms we were picking up on the schoolyard? Dick, cock, pussy, twat, schlong, and poontang. And where did Mrs. Bellier fit into all this? And why did we feel so funny around her? And furthermore, how was it that Charlie's dad moved out when he could have been having sex with Mrs. Bellier whenever he wanted? This last subject was one on which we speculated with great energy, puzzled over the Bellier's volatile separation on the one hand versus the stability of the Spada family. Was there something we didn't understand about marriage? In the autumn of the, oops, I better take a drink here. Prost. In the autumn of the same year that Charlie shot Dougie, I was walking to my fourth period art class with my cohorts, shoving and punching each other out of the breezeway between the buildings. David Young ran up behind us, breathless, and said, "They shot President Kennedy." When we got into class, the PA system announced that indeed the President of the United States had been gunned down in Dallas. Our art teacher, a spaced out but otherwise pleasant woman with the slow, precisely articulated speech of someone who's been around children too long, began to sob quietly. All of the girls and some of the boys in the class began to cry too. Our teacher tried to restore order, but halfway into every sentence, she'd break into these long, racking moans. It was unsettling. The PA came on again. School was closing for the day, and those who did not walk to school were to report to their homerooms pending bus scheduling. The rest of us were free to go. Even in late November, it was a mild day in Los Angeles, and being a Friday, despite the events, it felt great to be leaving early. As weekends go, however, it was terrible. All sporting events were canceled. All television shows on the national networks and local stations were canceled. Everything was canceled. Although my parents went out that night, working class folks didn't cancel a night out for anything. There was nothing to watch on television. Instead, they ran movies about Abraham Lincoln and repeated the same news stories over and over. I went to bed and listened to the airliners landing at LAX until I fell asleep. A pall fell over everything on Saturday. Just a few of us, Charlie Bellier, Tommy Allen, and Charlie Cameron, gathered in the alley and devised the most excruciating tortures imaginable for the guy who shot the president. The Catholic kids among us, Jim Flynn, Francis O'Leary, and Roger Rowe, all had to stay home. Their families took it pretty hard about the Catholic president. By Sunday, my buddies and I were out of our minds with boredom. Everything was shut down. I ate my cereal with the TV on because they were bringing Lee Harvey Oswald out for a jail transfer. Do you all know who he was? Okay. All right. On the screen, a bunch of guys in white suits and cowboy hats waited around. I decided nothing exciting would happen. My dad walked into the kitchen as I put my bowl in the sink. "I'm going to Tommy Allen's," I said. "What's that on television?" he said. "I think it's the basement of the jail where they have Oswald, the guy that shot the president. They're going to move him. Did Mom make coffee?" "Yeah, I'll see you later, Dad. Stay out of trouble." Tommy Allen was a celebrity in our circle because he'd been run over more times than any other kid. He even managed to get run down by a Good Humor ice cream truck, which was a real work of art. He'd meant it to fake as a diversion while Roger Rowe robbed the icebox when the driver got out to see if Tommy was dead. I hung around Tommy's until his mother kicked us both out. And then we found Charlie Bellier and Charlie Cameron. The two Charlies had been to church and had a few hours to kill. And Bellier had an idea. Let's make a dummy. We scrounged whatever clothes, newspapers, and hangers we could find for the frame and stuffing, and in short order, we had a pretty good-looking dummy, roughly life-size. The first stop was the balcony over the apartment where three stewardesses, that's what they called them in those days, lived. These gals were almost as fascinating as Mrs. Bellier. We had the theory that sex was going on in there because the three women threw a lot of parties, and more than once the police came around. And there was a big white polar bear rug in the living room. The first picture of a naked woman I ever saw had her spread out on a rug just like that, and it became of great interest to me ever after. We hung the dummy over the railing, and we waited. We heard the door open. We dropped the dummy in front of the landing of the apartment, and there was a ripping scream. When the stewardess realized what had happened and looked up, her face went from fear to anger and finally into a smile. "You boys," she said, starting to laugh, "you boys are going to get into some real trouble someday." A blond man came out and looked up at us. He wore a shirt with epaulets and metal wings over the pocket, a pilot. We came down and picked up the dummy, keeping straight faces until I made the mistake of looking at Charlie Bellier. All he did was raise his eyebrows at me, and I burst out laughing, and we took off running. The pilot started after us, but his girlfriend called him off. "Little bastards," he yelled. "You have no respect for anything right after the president gets assassinated." We headed over to Belford Avenue where Charlie Bellier lived. There, 93rd Street turned 90 degrees into Belford Avenue. and it was the perfect place to tuck a dummy under a car. Drivers turning the corner wouldn't see it until they were on top of it. Clayton Spada and his brother came up the street returning from church. Although Mrs. Spada didn't like her boys associating with us because we were public school kids and therefore delinquents, Clayton liked hanging around with us. He had the awkward air of a kid who never learned to throw a baseball. He was very studious but had envy in his eyes when he came home from school with his stack of books and saw us lighting out for the ball field with our gloves and bats and cleats. The few times I had been in the Spada's apartment, I had found it strange with statues of bleeding Jesus on the cross. And like every other Catholic household I'd ever been in, there was a smiling portrait of John F. Kennedy hanging there right over the dining table. Fred walked by but stopped and watched from a distance. Clayton stayed with us. "What you guys doing?" Clayton said. "What do you think?" Charlie said, pointing to the dummy. "What are you going to do with that?" Clayton said. "Watch." Charlie and I slid the dummy just behind the front wheels of a Buick LeSabre so that only the legs were visible. To a driver coming around the corner, it looked like someone fixing his car but lying in the road. We crouched behind the Buick to hide, including Clayton. We didn't have to wait long. The first car that came around was a Borg Ward, a strange-looking thing, but the man behind the wheel never saw the dummy. The second car was a late-model Oldsmobile with a woman driving. She glanced to her right, then straight ahead, then her head snapped to the right again, and her mouth formed an O, and she wrenched the wheel to the left, and the car heeled way over, and she clipped the tail of a Chevy parked on the other side of the street. The crash was louder than you'd expect for the damage done, and by the time she came to a stop, we were running away. Looking back, I saw her crawl over to the passenger door and get out. We tore down the breezeway of the building where Clayton lived and into a series of alleys beyond. I couldn't believe that Clayton was running right alongside us in that clumsy-footed way of his. It wasn't easy in wingtip shoes. When we stopped, Charlie and I laughed so hard that we couldn't speak, and Clayton was smiling, and Charlie Cameron had to take his glasses off to wipe his eyes. Tommy Allen cackled in a high-pitched staccato that made it hard for him to breathe. And this went on for a couple of minutes until we weren't laughing any longer, but just wheezing and coughing. "Did you see the look on her face?" Charlie Cameron said. "She'll be mad when she finds out that was a dummy," Clayton said. His eyes moved over each of us as if he could be part of the gang now. Naturally, we had to return to the scene of the crime. We slipped through the alleys via an alternate route. The woman was standing by the Buick crying, and there were several other adults there, including the owner of the Chevy. He was talking to the woman who had hit his car, trying to calm her down. The dummy was now lying on the Buick's hood, and two of the men looked around. I felt bad, although we had to keep ducking back around the corner so we could laugh. It was mirthless laughing now, and when I looked at Charlie Bellier, he looked worried rather than devilish. After an hour, the grown-ups left. The dummy still lay on the hood of the Buick. Clayton was very worried. "My mother's going to kill me," he said. I said, "Don't worry. Don't sweat it, Clay. Fred'll cover for you." "We were supposed to come straight home from church. Mother is really upset about the assassination." I said, "Well, it's not like Lee Harvey Oswald is running around Westchester Plaza." "You guys shouldn't do this stuff," Clayton said. "Clayton," Charlie Bellier said, putting his hand on his shoulder, "have we ever steered you wrong?" Clayton looked at Charlie, then at me, and then at Charlie again. "Fred says you guys shot Dougie." As soon as the words were out of his mouth, Mrs. Spada stalked around the corner with Fred right beside her, and with her was Mrs. Bellier. Charlie dropped his hand from Clayton's shoulder. Mrs. Spada looked us over. "Clayton, you go on with Fred. I talk to you later." They left. Mrs. Spada looked at us one at a time, long enough for each of us to look away. Her thick black and gray hair looked like iron. Her eyes were burning like an oil fire. "Did you do that?" she said, indicating the dummy. We looked at each other. I started to speak, but she cut me off. "You!" she said, pointing at me. "You! I know you! All the time! Big joker! Big joker! You think everything is funny." "But Mrs. Spada, you think it's funny to throw that thing in the street? You think so, Mr. Big Joker? I tell you something. Something else is a big joker. Someone else is a big joker, just like you. Big joker, just like you." "But Mrs. Spada, Lee Harvey Oswald, he's a big joker, and they fix big jokers." She spun on her heel and stomped off. We watched her broad back recede down the walkway and heard her thick-soled shoes clomping as she disappeared around the building. Mrs. Bellier looked at Charlie. "You'd better get on home, young man," she said. He left. Mrs. Bellier took me by the arm and led me a few steps away. "I've always liked you, Don. I always thought you were a good influence on Charlie." I didn't know what to say. She moved closer. "I hope nothing will happen to change my opinion of you," she said. "Mrs. Spada told me some things." I went through Charlie's room. There was a crushing feeling in my chest, and yet a strange excitement ran through me, starting right at the center of my body. I couldn't remember Mrs. Bellier being so close to me before. Her beautiful face was inches from mine. I felt myself getting flushed north and south as though my blood was heating and expanding, and if it kept going, my head would explode. "Do you know anything about a BB rifle?" The words went off like a sonic boom. Fred told his mother about Dougie, and Mrs. Spada told Mrs. Bellier. 1,000 things I could say swelled in my brain all at once, and there they got garbled. Mrs. Bellier's eyes locked onto mine. Her breasts were practically touching me. I could feel the pulse in my arm beating against her fingers. I never felt anything like this inside me before. I was trying to swim through the blood and the noise and grab some words, any words, to say to Mrs. Bellier before my head exploded and just ruined everything. I took a deep breath. "Yes, Mrs. Bellier, it's mine. I was showing it to Charlie, and I guess I forgot it." She leaned closer. "Is that all?" Jesus! I was taking the rap for the gun. Was I supposed to say that I pulled the trigger on Dougie? Maybe Mrs. Spada said that I did. I mean, what if she hadn't? What if she was talking about something else entirely, which could be one of 100 things that Mrs. Spada might say? I hope Charlie appreciated what I was doing for him. "No, Mrs. Bellier, honest, that's all, really, except for the dummy and stuff." Mrs. Bellier kept looking at me and then let go of my arm and patted it gently. Thank heaven she smiled just then, or I think I might have started crying. "Okay, Don." She turned to Tommy and the other Charlie. "You boys ought to go home now." She turned back to me. "And I don't think you're like Lee Harvey Oswald at all," she said. "Mrs. Spada is just very upset. She worshiped President Kennedy. You should go home to your family." She smiled again and then walked to the corner of the building and turned out of sight. I heard jungle drums beating. Tommy Allen whistled very quietly. "Mrs. Spada was really mad at you." "Why me?" I said. "I wasn't the only one here." "Well, you know," Charlie Cameron said, "she thinks you're a bad influence." "Me? What did I ever do?" Charlie looked thoughtful for a moment. "Well, she knows you don't go to church," he said. "Of all of us, even Bellier, I was the only one who didn't belong to any church, and it was no secret that my dad held no truck with religion. But I didn't think that made me into Lee Harvey Oswald." "Let's get the dummy out of here," I said. All the air had gone out of us at this point. We dismembered the dummy, and with nothing to be said, we drifted off. I slogged home. What if Mrs. Spada had called my mom? When I got the BB rifle, where would I hide it? Well, that was Charlie's problem, really. The closer I got to home, the more dread I felt at the idea of my father sitting there waiting to cross-examine me about the dummy and the gun and 10 other things that I figured he must have found out by then. I felt like a convict walking to the gallows. My dad was sitting in his chair, smoking an L&M and watching television. I could hear my mom in the kitchen. He smiled. "Why so glum? Hey, say, you really missed it this morning. Where have you been? Was this a trick? Was my dad acting normally? Or was this a trap?" "Oh, just messing around with Charlie and them for a couple hours." My dad said, "You know when you left this morning, not 2 minutes later, they brought Oswald out and some fella shot him right there, live on TV. My dad seemed like his normal self, and they shot Oswald." "Well, gee, Dad, I guess that's good then, isn't it?" "Why do you think that?" he said. "I mean, he shot the president and everything, so didn't he deserve it too?" On the TV, there were pictures of Oswald, including one of him holding a rifle and a book. He had a little smile on his face. It startled me how much he looked like Charlie Bellier. That was very weird. "Well, maybe, maybe not," my dad said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, son, I know it seems clear, but maybe it's not so easy. A man shoots the president, so then they catch him, and 2 days later he gets shot, and everything is fixed. That isn't the way the world always works, nice and tidy. But I thought that he was the guy, Oswald. My dad said, well, he might well be, but just imagine if he wasn't the guy. What if he was the wrong guy? Or he was there, but he wasn't the guy who did it? This all happened awfully quickly, I didn't like where this was going. What if he wasn't the Triggerman, my dad said. My blood ran cold. Maybe he was tricking me. He continued, what if Oswald, the man they said shot the president, what if it wasn't him? What if he was shot because they said he was the Triggerman? What if the guy who shot Oswald in the basement did it because of what everyone was saying, but it wasn't right? Maybe the guy he shot wasn't the actual Triggerman. And all I could think was, I swear it was Dougie who shot, Charlie who shot Dougie. I wasn't the Triggerman. Honestly, I'm not Lee Harvey Oswald, no matter what Mrs. Spada says. I don't think everything is so funny. I don't. I'm telling you, I wasn't the Triggerman. I wasn't the Triggerman. I'm not Lee Harvey Oswald. I am not Lee Harvey Oswald. Thank you.